Next on our speakers list, as you can tell from the sheet, is Dr. Sanchez. And we're going to get a slightly longer view and a look at what we may be able to do with some lunar exploration and going towards away from our planet. Please, either from the podium or where you are.
Can everybody hear me from here? I guess we're going to be moving from what you might call the ultimate hardware to software, because I'm going to be talking about information industries in outer space, which may at first glance sound a little odd, but overwhelmingly commercial users of space services are information service companies. Right now there are, of course, no lunar colonies, and there's one good reason for it. Nobody's been able to figure out how to make them pay. Colonies were established in the New World over the course of half a millennium. But unless they were economically viable, they never managed to survive. One example of colonization that didn't work was the example of the Norsemen, who came to the New World for political reasons, and who, after they exhausted their resource base and ran all their capital into the ground, all died, every one of them. Well, things aren't quite that bad for entrepreneurs in the space business these days. People don't really all die out, but they tend to drift away. And so we've seen really hundreds of companies come and go, some of them no more than a file folder. And the reason has been because they really can't get the capital and the products up and running quickly enough. The first attempt to establish a human lunar presence actually was a failure. We went there with no intention of staying, no capability of staying, and we haven't been back for so long that probably half the people that are interested in space have been born since the last manned mission. Literally, these are technologies as relevant to a lot of people interested in space as the Romans. As I say, lunar colonies haven't been built because there are no business enterprises that have found a way to integrate moon-based operations into their existing businesses. That is, moon-based operations cannot be seen as incremental, logical, or profitable extensions of existing businesses. Now, it might be very well to describe the development of hypothetical businesses using hypothetical technologies, none of which are proven, but probably the best way to get into space is by the extension of existing companies, existing product lines, and using existing markets. For example, this is the proposal that Motorola has with its Iridium system. They're simply going to provide a new level of an existing service and offer digital cellular telephone all over the whole world instead of just in restricted market areas. Well, the first slide looks at a couple of the industries that have been proposed for the moon. We've had oxygen, refined metals, and helium-3. And I'm proposing once again that we consider information to be an industry that would be profitable and viable on the moon. And I say this because information is the only product in the known universe that can be shipped from the bottom of Earth's gravity well all the way to the moon, processed and shipped all the way back essentially for free. Now, we've had people talk about the development of multi-billion-dollar infrastructures on the moon to ship gravel, for God's sake, that could be used to shield space colonies. We've had people talk about building massive industrial facilities on the moon to produce aluminum, to ship it up into well, L5 for among other locations. But of course, giant projects that cost hundreds of billions of dollars that have payoffs that are 20 to 50 years in the future are not commercial opportunities at all. However, moving large blocks of data around the planet now is routine. Millions, maybe tens of millions of people routinely move data around this planet, and probably hundreds of thousands of organizations right now are involved in this kind of business. Can I have the second one? And as I say, there is only one product in the known universe that can move freely between Earth and the moon at no cost, moving up and down the gravity wells. Expanding information industries onto the moon really is just an incremental step from the systems that we already have. We already have a planet-wide system of information transfer. Extending this network, just one more step really is not such a revolutionary step, but its consequences for space-based development might be kind of revolutionary. Because such a step is incremental, the role of moon-based information industries in the existing environment is going to be invisible to the end users. The profitability of these kinds of moon-based industries will probably be assured for a couple of reasons I'll talk about later. But compared to other industries, we are not going to have the problem of transportation. All the data that will be transferred from the Earth to the Moon in the first century of operation will have a total mass that's consistent with zero. And I don't know of any other industry that's ever been discussed that can make that claim operating from the Moon. It's no problem at all to acquire information from anywhere on the surface of the Earth, move it to the Moon and process it, and deliver it through something like the Iridium system to any point on the Earth. Real time, 24 hours a day. It's going to be no problem. And this is something that's really essential to think about, because I don't think that propositions that require massive 50-year commitments and enormous amounts of resources will be the first things that are developed in space. Data processing and a variety of teleservices. These teleservices can include online database services, expert system services, captive insurance services, offshore banking services, fiduciary and trust services, and shell company services. And the market area for these products will not only be the Earth and the Moon, but the entire Earth-Moon system and all the facilities that are built in it. Number 3. Rather than referring to this cluster of telecommunications, computer-based services, and physical facilities that support these services as information industries over and over again, I'm just going to refer to them as teleports. And this is a usage consistent already with the communications industry development of teleports. Interestingly enough, one of the biggest teleports in the world is in Barbados, which, as you may know, is one of the most competitive deliverers of offshore data processing services in the world. And anything that Barbados can do, I think American industry can compete with. In the beginning, any viable moon-based industry is predicated on the notion that the government of the United States is going to establish a regulatory climate that encourages such an investment. We've seen small steps in this direction in recent years, but we really don't have any kind of coherent industrial, fiscal, and economic policies to allow the development of these kinds of industries. Such policies need to include things like tax breaks, development of selected infrastructure, assistance in financing and/or guaranteeing of bonds, and R&D funding. While some people may object to these kinds of incentives on libertarian grounds, and libertarianism is a sentiment popular among space people, these incentives are typically used by state and local governments to encourage economic development. For example, the redevelopment of downtown San Antonio was expedited through these kinds of packages. And the only reason Japanese corporations select a location in the United States is because they've gone through what amounts to bidding wars in which local governments bid to see who will provide the most money for the privilege of having the major plant located in their area. And of course it is a privilege because of the number of additional jobs that are generated and the tax revenues that are generated. These kinds of incentive packages pay off, and that's why they exist. And one other consideration is the fact that without these kinds of incentive packages, it's going to take a lot longer to get into space. You know, we've lost a lot of 20s of years so far, and if any of us individually want to get into space, we really have to think about how many more 20s of years we can see go by, because not very many of us are going to make it into space as bureaucrats or 25-year-old Air Force officers, looking at the audience. And so I think that we're most likely to get there as entrepreneurs or investors. And so there has to be something to go out there too. Fortunately, many of the kinds of technologies that would be needed for information industries on the moon are already being developed, and a lot of them are already in place. Some of the kinds of things include the National Supercomputing Network, which is being funded by the National Science Foundation, development of massive parallelism supercomputers, which is being funded by DARPA, and of course the question of scalability of these, which is being developed by DARPA and a lot of private companies, and greater computer reliability, which is being funded by SDIO. Also, each one of these areas is being supported by massive private research monies. Regulatory changes that support this kind of system should be as revenue neutral as possible. That's not always going to be possible, but it's an important consideration because any kind of government policy changes that require outlays of money in our current economic conditions, and probably our future economic conditions, are going to run afoul of very, very fierce turf battles in Congress and in the White House, and they probably will not be able to be funded. The example of the space station is a very good one. going back and battling for the money year after year after year argues very strongly that direct appropriations is probably not the way to try to go with these things. So when I talk about subsidies, for the most part, I'm talking about things that are revenue neutral, which is to say it neither requires money from the government, nor does the government have to actually appropriate any money, but rather the subsidies will be fixed when they are attached to specific industries in ways that, as I will explain in a little while, don't really result in any net loss of revenue to the American Treasury, which is an important consideration.
Jim, sort of start coming down towards the conclusion. We're 15 minutes.
That's 15 already? Well, I guess I should skip ahead very quickly. Let's see the next overhead. I'll talk about these very quickly. A non-specific tax credits of 100% for capital investment made into space. Now, of course, there would be some limits on this because when you have industries that directly compete with each other, the Earth-based industries won't like it. But a number of new kinds of investments that don't have Earth-based competitors could receive this. A non-specific tax credit for profits earned in space that are retained in space. And by retained in space, I mean profits that are reinvested in one or more of a set of approved investment programs. And a buy space-based clause, similar to the buy Indian clause. Now, I principally see this as an advertising mechanism, but upon further reflection, it struck me just how similar a lot of the economic proposals made for space-based development resemble the kinds of economic proposals that one sees on Indian reservations. And I recall all too well, I was the San Carlos Apache tribe's economic planning director for a while, and I can remember Apaches with gleams in their eyes talking about government contracts. And I think that this is still really where our whole industry is at, and probably where we'll be for some time. But looking at this package of regulatory changes, which is really quite modest, is either very encouraging or argues for the fact that probably these kinds of industries will emerge through the services of helpful governments in places like Bahrain or Vanuatu. Looking at the specific industries, data processing is pretty obvious, and since I'm almost out of time, I'll skip past that one. But let's talk about offshore banking, because it seems to be obscure to a lot of people. Offshore banking is a major industry on this planet. Places like Bahrain have offshore banking deposits roughly equal to $500,000 per person. Offshore banking services are built to this level simply by modest regulatory changes. Offshore banking based on the moon would be able to recapture all the money that now flows overseas to countries that are providing offshore banking services to American enterprises, and would be able to have a subsidy that matched the degree to which these services were recaptured by American industry. Which is to say, as tax revenue was being lost, that is now being lost to overseas offshore banking service centers, was recaptured by the centers on the moon, a subsidy could be established to allow these to remain essentially revenue neutral. Because as you know right now, America's trade deficit on services, largely offshore services, is running at $20 to $25 billion a year. Another kind, which I'll go through much more quickly than I plan, is captive insurance services, which most people have probably not heard of. Captive insurance services are simply the opportunity for groups of American companies to set up a cooperative offshore, for example in Bermuda, where there are now more insurance companies than there are people. And these companies give people the option to evade some of the regulatory controls. For example, the insurance funds can reinvest in the bonds of the companies that set these things up, which really isn't prescribed in the United States. It just tends not to happen. And people have major cost savings. And for example, with captive insurance industries right now have a trade deficit for the United States of $5 billion a year. So we're looking at considerable amounts of money. One advantage that could also come out of the development of captive insurance services on the moon would be the opportunity to develop a space-based insurance pool to finance launch services, which are still quite expensive, especially for people that are launching expensive payloads. We just had an example of how low the cost can be, but if you're launching a $100 or $150 million communications satellite, and the record for those has been kind of grim in the last couple of years, the insurance premiums can be very, very high. And so For the kinds of regulatory changes that I've described, just really outlined very quickly, the establishment of insurance services on the moon would have enough synergy that it might end up paying for the entire facilities on the moon. Because we're not talking about massive billion-dollar projects. We're talking about something that probably won't cost $50 million in total. Expert system services are another opportunity if things can be delivered by the wire. Some examples of this are, for example, the space station. The space shuttle now uses an expert system to configure its payloads because the last two people that can do this are retiring. Well, under a buy space-based clause, it would be possible to deliver these same services from the moon, and giving tax breaks for capital investment in the moon would mean that the cost of the software development could be recovered as a tax credit. These different services will develop their profitability at different rates. On the moon, setting up a series of small teleports in a high lunar latitude or low lunar latitude near one of the poles would now allow these systems to provide redundant coverage of the entire world. The first services that would become profitable would be offshore banking, which right now I think has about $1 trillion in assets on the Earth, and services such as captive insurance services. Further down the line, other services such as expert systems, database delivery systems would become competitive as the infrastructure was built up and as people more routinely started to use these services, especially given the amount of tax credits that would be associated with them. Now, once this system was up and running, it would allow a lot of small 1- and 2-person firms that were interested in space entrepreneurship to actually get a start, mainly through the application of telerobotic systems on the moon, but also through the development of software services. And it would be a tremendous advantage for companies that were developing software on Earth to be able to use the facilities on the moon because of the tax breaks. I might note parenthetically that although we haven't really seen it yet, this kind of environment would allow local governments, such as cities, states, and counties, to actually have a space program, because they could routinely buy chunks of these systems, and these systems would enable them, in turn, to provide the tax credits and data processing services through business incubators to support local business startups in high technology areas. I'll skip the physical description of the systems, because basically what we're talking about is very, very simple devices, maybe satellites no bigger than a surveyor, basically with some kind of massive parallel processing system where the individual processors and RAM chips can be isolated by failure, and redundant telecommunication systems.
Do come down towards the conclusions. We're going to have a couple questions.
Okay. Well, I would just summarize then, because I guess I've run out of time, that developing these teleports on the moon are a logical and incremental step away from the systems that we already have. I'm not describing a 10 or 20-year program. I'm not describing something that costs billions of dollars. And I'm not talking about manufacturing processes that are entirely untested. I'm talking about an incremental addition to a telecommunications system that already spans one planet and simply expanding it incrementally out to include the moon in its system. Establishing these things with a set of tax credits and tax incentives that are really going to be needed by the balance of the industry in any event will give us the basis for establishing structurally competitive teleservices on the moon and being able to market them worldwide through a distribution system that will be as close to one that couldn't be better if it was designed for it. And I'm describing these kinds of low Earth orbit cellular digital telecommunication systems that are already in the works. These kinds of systems are very small and very inexpensive. And I think that we could really see something along this line within about the next 10 to 20 years. And I think that probably no other industry will be able to compete in this time frame because of the advantages that information has in moving in and out of the gravity wells, which is the fact that it has no mass at all.
Very good. Questions?
Yes, I was wondering, is there going to be people in this loop that you're proposing, or is this going to be completely unmanned, transponders?
Initially it would be unmanned, but as the system built up, I mean, obviously the first systems would be unmanned, but as the system built up and there were more and more users, you would just keep adding units, and at some point the cost effectiveness of teleoperator systems would fall below that of having manned stations on the moon, and then jobs would open up. That's usually the way people move to a place, is there were jobs.
Question?
Are your people users on the moon? And if they're not, why not just put your telecommunications and computation equipment in low Earth orbit? Why have it on the moon?
The reason why is because historically, things such as ships and airplanes haven't been seen as extending the sovereignty of countries. Now, of course, there's the question on the moon, things like the Moon Treaty, and questions of whether or not somebody can actually use the moon for profitable purposes. But remember, this is not a mining operation. The moon might be the common heritage of mankind, but information that is owned by a company in Peoria that is processed in a batch mode on the moon remains the property of that company, even as it's processed in return. So while the moon may be the common heritage of mankind, I think we can argue that there's a presumption that someone can't land a satellite or a lunar module on somebody else's lunar module at, say, 6 kilometers a second. I think just for safety requirements, people would be enabled to establish an economic zone around established facilities. And there was also precedent for teleoperator systems to establish some kind of right to use, but again, it's only on a physical place. You know, there's been a lot of efforts to start small countries in the last 20 years so that people could run casinos, say, off the coast of Los Angeles. But they always talk in terms of actually getting an atoll or a seamount that they could sink something on, because historically in the law, if you're not a country with a physical place, you're not a physical place.
So essentially, you're using this as a ploy for doing something else later on.
Sure. Let's pick up a couple more. Yes, ma'am.
I'm certainly all in favor of doing anything we can to get things developed on the moon. In fact, I've used this idea of offshore banking when I've talked to, non-space enthusiasts. But really, when you look at it, either having just a relay station there, or even having people there, people will, I'm talking about it, people say, well, why not just keep on using, the offshore facilities we have here? Why not keep on using the things on land? There's no reason to go up to a relay station in orbit or at the moon. There's no reason to even have people physically there. You do things on Earth. So the thing is that your ideas, which are otherwise good and will eventually happen as the moon gets developed, seems like it dies a boring.
Well, except for one small problem, and the question is, why would Chase Manhattan have branches in every offshore banking center in the world? Surely Vanuatu does not add so much to it. Initially, this will be add-ons to systems that already exist. Routinely, companies like Chase Manhattan will add their stations on the moon. Now, I'm not saying, originally when I thought about this, I thought it might be good to add some kind of regulation which gave a competitive advantage to American offshore banking activities on the moon as opposed to American offshore banking activities in Bahrain or Singapore. But now I don't think that's even necessary. The volume of this is so large, offshore banking in the world as a whole, $1 trillion a year, that one more competitive center, initially it would probably only pick up a few $1 billion in the first couple of years. A few $1 billion in assets. But of course, if interest provisions were changed, and it was something that I ran out of time to talk about, it used to be that offshore banking interest that was held offshore was not taxed until it came back into the United States. Providing that incentive again to lunar-based activities would immediately give it a competitive advantage, but even without a competitive advantage, simply being one more center in the global network would give it as much access to the financial markets as Vanuatu, or Kiribati, or Cayman Islands, or Gibraltar, or any of these other offshore centers. And I'm not saying it's going to dominate this industry. It'll probably be a minor player for a generation or more. But a minor player that's got $10 billion worth of deposits is certainly something different in terms of the kinds of money we've been expecting to see raised on the moon before.
Okay, I think we need to give Dr. Sanchez a round of applause.
Over the proceedings? Do you have copies?
No, but I have, you can drop a line to me, and I'll send you copies of this one as well as the previous.
And I
paper.
think you can see why he's been a member of the NSS board for a number of years.